Samuel Greyfeather thought he was returning to nothing but ruins. When he climbed the rickety ladder into his grandfather's abandoned treehouse, the boards creaked like old bones. Everyone in town had mocked it. Just a rotting nest, they laughed. But under the dust, Samuel found something else. Carvings so intricate they seemed to breathe, and a leather scroll with words that shook his soul. This house holds our people's spirit. Protect it. He had no wealth, no family waiting, no reason to fight for a forgotten past. Yet as the wind howled through the pines and an eagle circled above, Samuel knew he couldn't walk away. What he uncovered next would turn a derided ruin into a beacon of pride and hope for generations. But before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this story of heritage and resilience travels. The town of White Elk sat in a bowl of wind and light between high-shouldered mountains, where winter overstayed its welcome, and even summer mornings wore a chill like a shawl. Main Street was a thin seam stitched with neon signs and hand-painted windows, a trail of brick and clapboard that looked small against the blue immensity of the Montana sky. That sky was clean and merciless. Clouds rode it like white bison, stamping shadows over the valley, and a hawk's cry traveled farther than a man's promise. The weather that week was a lesson in contrasts, sun bright as a welding torch by day, needles of cold by night, so that every window sweated at noon and frosted at dawn. Gusts barreled down from the ridges with the temper of old gods, rattling license plates and pulling at the sleeves of anyone foolish enough to stand still on the sidewalk. Tourists called it dramatic. Locals called it Tuesday. By the time Samuel Greyfeather drove in, the wind had a bite to it, and the scent of snow clung to the mountain's rim like a rumor. His truck, a sun-faded blue Ford that had outlived 2 engines and 3 owners, rattled into a parking slot outside the Mercantile, and he sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, watching his breath fog the cab. 55 years had taught him to measure his steps and save his words, but the sight of White Elk, the diner that had lost its apostrophe and never found it again, the barber shop with its fading pole, the laundry flapping shirts like white flags of surrender, shook loose a few things he thought he had put away for good. He rubbed the ridge of scar tissue that cut a pale diagonal along his jaw, the old souvenir of a job that had gone wrong on a pipeline site in Wyoming when he was 23, and believed his body could outvote steel. That scar had made him cock his head in photographs, and sent whispers ahead of him into rooms. Folks called him careful after that, though his carefulness had the shape of grief. The kind a man collects by staying alive when other men do not. He stepped out of the truck with the slow grace of a man who had used his back like a tool all his life. He was tall but not towering, ropey rather than bulky, with shoulders settled by work and a posture that knew both apology and pride. His hair, once the black of raven's wings, had thinned and gone iron gray at the temples. It brushed his collar in a way that would have annoyed his grandmother but pleased his younger self. His face was a ledger of weather and years, cheekbones high and nose straight, the skin a warm umber that deepened in summer and held the memory of sun in winter. He wore a denim shirt with pearl snaps and a jacket the color of coffee grounds, scarred at the cuffs, and his boots carried 4 states' worth of dust inside their seams. Some said he smiled slow, others said he smiled with his eyes before his mouth remembered how. The bell on the Mercantile door announced him with a sound like a penny, spinning on wood. Inside was the smell of cedar cleaner and dried beans. A row of antlers crowned the rear wall above a rack of fishing line. The owner, Mrs. June Perkins, stood behind the counter with a calculator that remembered the 80s. June was a woman who made practical look elegant, silver hair braided and looped like a crown, eyes the blue of summer flax, and knuckles enlarged by arthritis, but quick as minnows on a keyboard. She wore a plaid shirt under a knitted vest, and she had the posture of a person who'd hauled more than she weighed for longer than anyone guessed. "You're either buying rope or trouble," she said when she saw him, her voice sanded smooth by decades of greeting both strangers and cousins. "Sometimes it's the same line," Samuel answered, a smile ghosting his mouth. "June, right?" "I'm Samuel Greyfeather. I know whose face you're wearing," she said, and softened. "You've got Edwin's eyes, except yours don't dare as much. You passing through?" Not this time. He placed his hands on the counter, as if setting down two heavy thoughts. "I came back to see what's left on the ridge." June's mouth made a small shape that could have been sympathy or mischief. "What's left is a treehouse that should have fallen last winter and didn't, because stubbornness is an architectural feature in this county. I suppose the rumors are true then. You inherited it." "He left me more question than house," Samuel said. "But I'll start with nails and see where it goes." A man 2 aisles over, broad as a barn door and wearing a cap embroidered with a trout, turned and gave a look that was friendly, the way a dog's warning bark is friendly. This was Tom Barlow, known locally as a fix-it in the truest sense. He could fix a fence, a carburetor, or a mood, depending on which one was most likely to break. Tom was in his late 40s, face square and clean-shaven except for a penciled mustache that he trimmed with the focus other men reserved for hunting. His eyes were an honest hazel, his complexion burnt pale by sun, and laughter had learned to live in the fan of lines at their corners. "You going up there alone?" Tom asked, stepping nearer. "That ladder's got opinions, and the bark beetle's got religion." "I've been alone longer than the ladder's been vertical," Samuel answered, not unkindly. He liked Tom immediately. It's hard to argue with a man who introduces himself as Worry. "But if you've got the name of a good mill or a better prayer, I'll take either." "Mill's Simmons's, and prayer's whatever June says before she unlocks the till," Tom said. "I can come up tomorrow with a brace and bit, put eyes on the damage. No charge for looking. I like a puzzle that insults me." June slid a pad across the counter. "Write down the list you don't know you need," she said. "Nails, yes. Rope, yes, because everything up there either needs tying down or wants to leave. Headlamp, because the loft eats light. And coffee, because you won't like what you see without it." Samuel bought it all and more, including a small tin of liniment, because there are mornings the body is a house with stairs. When he turned, another figure had drifted in with the wind. Deputy Ranger Alina Crow, uniform crisp, jacket zipped, hat brim shadowing eyes the color of river stones. Alina was in her early 30s, lean as a larch, with hair cut to the jawline and tucked behind one ear, the ear hung with a simple silver feather. Her skin carried the bronze of long miles, and she moved with the economy of someone trained to spend strength like money. She was Northern Cheyenne on her mother's side, Norwegian on her father's, and in her, the two heritages had made a quiet alloy. Practical, precise, unafraid of silence. "Mr. Greyfeather," she said, reading his name off June's receipt as if it were a badge. "You planning to be on the ridge before sundown?" "Planning to be," Samuel said. "Planning and arriving are cousins that don't talk," Alina replied, almost smiling. "Storm shelf sitting west. If you're stubborn, bring caution tape and humility." "I packed one of those," Samuel said. "Guess which?" Alina tipped her hat in a gesture that was both official and kind. "I do patrols up there," she said. "Radio's sketchy, but if you flash a light 3 times and then twice, I'll come looking." People get turned around in those trees. They think the ground is a straight line because maps are. "It isn't," And the house? Samuel asked. What do you know of it? Only that every kid in White Elk dares every other kid to spend a night in it, Alina said. They don't. They say it creaks. They say a raven keeps watch. They say on still days you can hear someone humming, "My mother hummed," Samuel said. And something in his voice neither rose nor fell. It just unfolded. She had died when he was 17, a sudden illness that knocked a plank out of his world and sent him walking hard and far. He had worked ranches and oil fields, roofing crews and survey teams, any job with a horizon. He had married once, briefly, to a woman with hands soft as bread and a laugh that wanted other cities. They had parted without drama, and with a bruise that lasted longer than they admitted. Somewhere along the way, his grandfather Edwin had grown small inside a big chair, and letters had arrived with 2 lines of news and a paragraph about weather. When Samuel's father died, father and son had been strangers, who shared a surname and a silence. These were the facts that hung in him like slow bells. He loaded boards and rope into the truck and turned north toward the ridge road, past pastures the color of tired gold, past the feed store with the hand-lettered sign, "Hay cash only, don't ask," past a row of trailers where wind chimes clattered like, "Shut your gossip." The pavement surrendered to gravel. Gravel surrendered to packed earth. The packed earth climbed as if it were remembering something and wanted to get there first. Lodgepole pines shouldered close, their trunks a parade of gray-brown columns, and the air cooled until his hands felt like a stranger's hands on the wheel. When the old road forked, he took the left, guided less by memory than by a sensation in the bones, the way a man might find his way back to a river by thirst alone. He parked where the track narrowed to a suggestion and shouldered the pack. The trail underfoot was a surprising draft of needles and mud. Where a culvert had washed out, someone had thrown a plank, and he crossed it with a care that was more respect than fear. Sun lanes came through the crown and painted the forest in bars. The deep smell of humus and sap rose the way hymns rise. From below, from years that had fallen and become soil. A raven watched him from a snag with the comic severity only ravens possess. Its feathers threw back blue in the light, and its head cocked as if it recognized the set of his shoulders. "I'm just visiting," he told it, and then, as if that were not precise enough, "I came to listen." The first sight of the treehouse came as a shock and a recognition. It rose out of a ring of old growth like a secret a giant forgot to keep. The supporting trunk was a patriarchal pine that had survived lightning and wind, its bark split in puzzle pieces, sap scarred in amber tears. The house itself had been built in the 1960s when men believed a good ladder made insurance unnecessary, and it wore that era like a stubborn cologne. The main platform was cinched to the tree with bands of seasoned steel. Branches had been worked around rather than against, so that the house grew in and the tree grew up, and the two had made a kind of marriage. Shingles had gone silver and then gray. One corner sagged as if the house were tired of standing brave. The ladder ran up at a tilt, steps made of 2x4s bolted through, wraps of rope added later when the bolts had become a rumor. A prayer flag. No, not a flag. Just a scrap of bandana once red and now a shy pink, hung from a nail and trembled like a small, determined heart. Samuel tilted his head and let the scene settle into him. He could read work the way some people read tone. He could see where a board had been sistered to another board after a windstorm, where a brace had been shimmed with a section of yardstick. Edwin had always used what he had, where the pulley system for hoisting supplies had been upgraded from clothesline to real rope. He could see his grandfather's hand in the swallowtail angle of a joint, in the way a corner refused to split because someone had respected grain. He climbed the ladder slowly, testing each rung with the heel of his boot. feeling for the language of rot. Give, sponge, complaint. The wind moved the crown, and the whole world swayed, not dangerously, but with the frank honesty of trees. At the landing, he paused. The door was a half-height thing, practical in winters, with a square window cracked in one corner and repaired with cellophane tape long ago. A child's sticker of a thunderbird had been pasted on the frame and faded to a ghost of itself. The key from June worked. The hinge protested, and then remembered its job. The first breath inside tasted of dust and cedar, mouse and time. Light came in slats and ribbons. The main room was 16 by 12 to his measuring eye. The floorboards were narrow, sanded smooth by countless feet, and then scuffed back to honesty by weather. A small iron stove hunched by the far wall, with a pipe that elbowed through the roof. Its belly cold, but its presence warm in memory. He could picture Edwin crouched beside it, feeding it with slivers, flames reflected in the old man's eyes. There was a cot with a wool blanket folded at the foot, a crate of paperback westerns with sunburned spines, a mason jar of nails beside a hammer whose handle had been darkened by the oils of 3 hands. And there were carvings. Not the fine museum pieces he would one day discover. Other rooms would hold those stories. No, these were the simple beginnings and the steady middles. Little animals cut from pine, a coyote with its laugh underway, a trout that seemed to want a stream beneath it, the profile of a woman's face contained in a single line that knew where to stop. The walls had been sketched upon. Pencil arcs traced the habit of a hand at night. Numbers tallied board feet and remembered measurements. On one beam, his own name appeared, written clumsily in a boy's uppercase, Samuel, the E backward, the L sprawling like a half-tamed colt. He touched the letters with 2 fingers, and a sound rose in him that he did not intend and could not avoid. A photograph was tacked under a nail, the paper gone the color of weak tea. It showed Edwin in his middle years, the hair dense and black, the jaw shaved to blue shadow, the eyes mischievous, a raven perched unbothered on his shoulder, as if the two had struck a pact. Another man stood beside him, broad-chested, handsome, wearing a grin that belonged to people who get invited to everything. Samuel's father, young in a way that still startled. Their hands held the same shape. The back of the photo had 3 words written in graphite. Home up high. Samuel set his bag down and moved carefully around the room, learning its temper. He opened the small shutter to let in more light, propped it with a stick, and watched dust go to glitter in the shaft. The house answered the wind with small complaints and larger approvals. A rope creaked the way a memory creaks when someone uses it after too long. He knelt by a section of floor that bore his grandfather's knife marks, a familiar shorthand of tiny notches. Edwin had indexed his life this way, a lunar calendar impressed into wood. He found a coffee tin of screws, sorted by size, a folded deck of topo maps with pencil scars, and a tin whistle that, when he lifted it, made the soft chime of an old coin. He did not yet find a letter. He did not yet find a hidden drawer or a tool wrapped in oilcloth. What he found was the first thing an honest house offers, the feeling of being seen by walls that remember you. He stepped back out onto the small porch that looked down through branches into a bowl of green. The air was so clear, it felt like it might break if you said the wrong truth. On the far ridge, stormlight pooled like ink under a brush. He could hear water moving somewhere below. A seasonal creek, maybe, just now remembering it was alive. A pine cone let go and clattered softly onto the platform, bounced once like a question. "I'm here," he said to no one and everything. "I came back." He could name the reasons: an inheritance that made accountants laugh, a retirement package that was more suggestion than cushion. A life that had grown too neat and too empty in a town where he knew the barista's dog, but not his neighbor's mother. But the larger reason was not in the book of reasons men can read aloud. It was in the way the mountain had visited him in dreams, the way a raven had crossed the windshield at a stoplight in Pueblo, and he had wept for no country he could name. The way his hands had woken with the ache of tools they had not held in years. He ate standing up, the kind of sandwich that tastes exactly like bread, cheese, and hope, then set about the practicalities because romantic thoughts do not keep houses upright. He tested the corner that sagged and found the culprit, a bracket that had split along a knot's secret. He measured, wrote numbers on his palm the way Edwin used to do when paper felt too formal, and considered how a sister brace might argue with gravity. He checked the lashings where the steel band met the tree and found them acceptable but aging. He swept the floor with a broom that had lost half its straw and all its patience. He set a bucket under the roof's little leak, and the plink of drops took up a rhythm. He talked aloud, not for company, but because words, once spoken in a place, know how to find their way back. As the afternoon tilted, the light inside turned the color of honey over toast. He found himself humming, and then he realized it was the same tune he had heard in his childhood when his mother combed his hair with water and her fingers. He stopped, the sound snapping off like thread. A shadow moved in the doorframe, and he turned fast, which is a young response to an old feeling. It was only the raven, land stepping along the porch rail, head canted like a priest with a joke. Its beak clicked once in a sound that could have been approval or hunger. "I didn't bring offerings," Samuel said. "I only brought work." The bird flicked one wing. Somewhere below in the brush, he heard the soft, uncertain footfall of a creature trying not to be a creature. A deer, he thought. Or maybe the neighbor's old dog, Blue, who had been old 10 years ago and might still be practicing. He shouldered the pack, locked the door, and began the climb down in a body that had not yet decided whether to forgive him for the climb up. At the base of the tree he circled once, laid his palm against the bark, and felt the slight warmth under his hand. Sap moving, life insisting, a clock older than calendars returning him to a time that did not need his name for it to be true. On the walk back to the truck, he rehearsed conversations he would not have. To June, he would say, "It will stand." To Tom, "Bring the brace, bring the humor." To Alina, "If I flash the light 3 times and then twice, it is because I want you to see this, not because I am lost." The first fat drops of the storm struck the brim of his hat as he reached the road, and the world grew the smell of wet metal and resin. He slid behind the wheel and sat a moment with the engine off, listening to the roof drum, feeling the way a small place takes a big man and reduces him to scale. He laughed once, softly, and spoke into the empty cab the simple vow of a man who has made too many and kept too few. "I'm staying," he said. "Mock it if you want." "I'm staying." He drove down the ridge as the squall threw its handfuls of grit, and White Elk welcomed him with a light in June's window and the mutter of the bar's television. He ate a bowl of chili that did not apologize for its peppers and drank coffee that did not apologize for being coffee. When Tom slid onto the stool beside him, smelling like rain and rope, they planned the morning with the economy of men who know daylight is a limited currency. Outside, the storm passed like a big animal changing minds, and the stars returned sharp enough to carve. In bed at the motel, the Timberline, whose sign blinked TIMB _LINE like Morse, he lay on his back and watched the ceiling fan communicate with the dark. The treehouse replayed behind his eyes, not as a set of unsolved problems, but as a place where breath sounded like belonging. He slept the way tired men sleep when there is something difficult and good to do in the morning. Morning bled pale across the horizon, the storm that had rattled White Elk now retreating into the mountains like a sulking giant. The air smelled of wet pine and earth freshly turned, and fog lay low across the ridge in long silver ribbons. Samuel Greyfeather rose before dawn, his body used to early calls, his mind restless with the shape of the treehouse carved behind his eyelids. He packed a thermos of coffee and a coil of rope, slung his hammer at his side, and drove back toward the old trail. The forest greeted him with dripping branches and the echo of unseen wings. When he reached the base of the giant pine, he felt the hush of morning magnified. The raven from yesterday still lingered, perched like a black sentinel on the upper branches. It croaked once, as though to mark his arrival. He climbed steadily, his boots sure despite the damp wood. The boards creaked in complaint, but the house seemed to accept him more easily this time, as if his vow to stay had been heard. Inside, dust had settled in soft carpets, and the pale light revealed details he had missed before. Carvings on the beams, small circular etchings almost too faint to notice, and shapes that resembled wings outstretched. He crouched near the cot, drawn to a small chest wedged between wall and stove, hidden partly by an old quilt. The chest was no larger than a bread box, its surface dulled by age but still bearing a faint pattern scorched into the leather cover that wrapped it. He lifted it carefully, the hinges stiff, and discovered within a tightly rolled piece of dark leather, stiff with time, the edges cracking but intact. The roll bore the emblem of a thunderbird, etched with deliberate strokes, a bird with wings wide, talons outstretched, a design that had passed through his people for generations. Samuel's breath caught, the hairs rising along his arms. The sight pulled him back to boyhood, when his grandfather Edwin had once told him tales by the stove, stories of birds that carried prayers to the sky, stories Samuel had ignored then because he had wanted the wider world more than the old one. Now, years older, his hands shook as he unrolled it. The writing was faded but legible, done in Edwin's careful script that slanted slightly to the right. Words that felt as though they had been written not just to be read but to be heard. "This house is not just timber and nail," the letter said. "It is the soul of our blood, tied to the wind, bound to the roots. Listen to the forest, Samuel. It remembers what we forget. Protect it, for it holds more than shelter. It holds us." He let the words sink into him, heavy as stone yet light as breath. They were not the idle musings of an old man. They were instruction, a torch passed across time. A sound startled him then, the shuffle of feet on the ladder. Samuel rose, wary, and set the scroll aside. A figure appeared in the doorway, ducking under the frame. It was an old man, not his grandfather, but someone still, vital despite age. His name was Henry Tallfeather, a distant cousin from the Crow Reservation 30 miles east, though Samuel had not seen him in decades. Henry was in his late 70s, his back slightly bent, but his frame wiry, muscles preserved by years of manual labor. His face was carved by deep lines, skin bronze like cured hide, and his eyes dark and alert, holding a glint of humor even in solemn moments. His hair was silver, tied back in a short braid, and his mustache curved downward like two commas framing a mouth that often spoke truths sharper than knives. He leaned on a carved walking stick adorned with beads, each color telling a memory. "I heard a truck on the ridge," Henry said, his voice gravelly but steady. "Knew it wasn't hunters. Only family comes this way, and you look like Edwin had the good sense to leave something behind." His gaze fell on the leather scroll, and his eyes softened. So he finally passed it on. Samuel gestured for him to sit, offering the cot. You knew? Henry eased himself down with the patience of age. Of course. This treehouse wasn't just Edwin's foolish project, no matter what the town laughed. It was a sentinel. Your grandfather always said the spirits of the old ones perched closer to the sky. He believed this place was a bridge between us and them. He carved, he listened, he prayed here. And when he built it, he marked it with the Thunderbird, so the family would know. Samuel turned the scroll in his hands. Why me? I left. I forgot Henry studied him for a long moment, eyes narrowing as if measuring weight. Because sometimes the one who leaves is the one who sees most clearly when he returns. You've been shaped by the outside world, bent and scarred. That scar on your jaw, I'd bet it wasn't just steel that cut you, but choices. Those choices make you strong enough now to carry what Edwin feared would die. Silence settled, broken only by the rustle of the raven outside. Henry continued. Your grandfather told me years ago. The boy will come back when he hears the trees speak louder than the city. Looks like he was right. The words struck Samuel deeper than he cared to admit. He poured them both coffee from his thermos. The steam mingled with dust, the warmth anchoring him to the present. For a long while they sat together, two men bound by blood and by the quiet authority of an old man's handwriting. After Henry left, promising to return in a few days with stories and tools, Samuel remained alone with the scroll. He traced the Thunderbird emblem again, feeling the grooves beneath his fingertips. The house seemed to hum faintly, as though agreeing. The raven cawed from its perch, wings beating once in approval before it took to the sky. Samuel stepped onto the porch, the wind rising to meet him. He looked out over the valley, where fog was lifting to reveal the patchwork of forest and meadow. The words of his grandfather echoed, "Listen to the forest. It remembers what we forget." And for the first time in years, Samuel allowed himself to listen. Not with ears only, but with the stillness of his heart. He heard the murmur of the creek, the steady rhythm of branches swaying, the far-off call of an elk. They were not random sounds. They were threads of a song he had once ignored, a song his grandfather had tried to teach him. Now, the song felt like it was waiting for him to answer. The next mornings came raw and cold, each dawn tugging mist across the ridges like worn blankets over sleeping giants. Samuel Greyfeather made the climb to the treehouse daily now, his boots memorizing each rung of the ladder, his muscles adjusting to the sway of the pine and wind. The house seemed to breathe differently with his presence, boards shifting less in protest, the air carrying more warmth than before. He slept there some nights, wrapped in the scratchy wool blanket left behind, letting the forest sounds cradle him in rhythms the city had never known. It was during these long stays that Samuel began to notice the world around him, speaking in ways he had once dismissed as chance. The sigh of the wind through needles no longer sounded like mere weather. It carried a cadence that felt like words half remembered. The gurgle of the nearby creek became a voice rising and falling, as if telling a story to whoever would listen. Ravens and eagles circled the crown of the tree, their wings beating patterns in the sky, their calls echoing in ways that left his chest trembling with recognition. He began to recall the boyhood days when his grandfather Edwin had pressed a knife into his small hands, guiding him in carving a crooked bear from a block of pine. "Respect the grain," Edwin had said, his own fingers steady, his face lit by the stove's glow. "Wood will tell you what it wants to be if you stop telling it what you want." Those words returned now with weight, as Samuel found himself reaching for one of the old carving knives he had discovered in a tin box under the cot. The handle fit his hand like a handshake, long delayed, the blade dull but eager. He started small, testing scraps of cedar left on the floor. His first cuts were clumsy, edges ragged, but the rhythm soothed him. By the third morning he had shaped a bird roughly, its wings uneven but unmistakable. He set it on the windowsill where the sunlight struck it, and a real raven landed nearby, cocking its head as though judging the attempt. Samuel chuckled to himself, an unsteady sound that soon grew full. The forest, it seemed, did not laugh at him. It encouraged him. On the fourth morning, while sharpening the blade on a whetstone, he heard a knock at the base of the ladder. Looking down, he saw a woman waiting with her hands in her pockets. She was slender, her frame long and strong as a sapling, standing with one hip leaned casually against the tree. She had hair the color of chestnuts braided over one shoulder, a few strands loose across her cheek. Her skin was pale, touched with the freckles of mountain sun, and her eyes were green-gray like lichen clinging to stone. She wore jeans tucked into scuffed boots, a flannel shirt layered under a canvas jacket, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew the land better than any map could explain. "Mind if I come up?" she called, her voice firm but not demanding. Samuel gestured assent, and she climbed, with practiced ease. When she reached the porch, she introduced herself. "Mara Whitfield. I live on the South Ridge, 2 miles east. Word travels quick in White Elk. Folks said Edwin's grandson came back. I figured I should see for myself Mara was in her late 30s, with the kind of weathered beauty carved by work outdoors. She smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and her handshake was sure, her palm calloused. She explained she was a homesteader, raising goats and tending a small orchard her parents had planted before a fire took their barn 15 years ago. Since then, she had rebuilt slowly, piece by stubborn piece, and that stubbornness had become her armor. People in town respected her but called her solitary, a woman who kept her own counsel and preferred the company of trees to gossip. "I used to bring your grandfather eggs," Mara said, looking around the dim cabin interior with eyes that softened at the carvings on the wall. "He'd trade me little wooden things. I still have a trout he carved. It hangs in my kitchen window. Folks laughed at his treehouse, but not me. Places like this carry more spirit than 4 walls on flat ground. Up here, you hear better." She touched one of the small carvings left on a shelf, tracing its edges. "You planning to stay?" "I think so," Samuel said. "He left me words. Told me to listen." Mara nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Then you'll start hearing things you didn't expect. The mountain has a voice, sometimes kind, sometimes harsh, but it's always honest." Her visit lingered with him long after she left, her words twining with the letter's counsel. That night, Samuel sat on the porch, letting the cold air bite his skin, and he did what his grandfather had told him to do long ago, but he had ignored. He listened without forcing meaning. In the weaving of wind, in the distant crack of branches, in the whistle of owls, he began to sense a pattern, like a drumbeat carried through generations. It was not just sound. It was presence. The days passed in quiet labor. Samuel repaired loose planks, patched holes, and continued carving small figures. Each time he cut into wood, he felt closer to his grandfather, closer to something older than both of them. At times he caught himself speaking aloud to the air, asking questions and receiving answers not in words, but in the shifting of wind or the call of birds. He felt less alone, as though the forest itself had taken a seat beside him. One evening, as twilight set the sky aflame, an eagle soared low above the treehouse, wings spread wide, its cry cutting through the dusk. Samuel felt it as a summons, a declaration. He followed the call with his eyes until the bird vanished into the distance, and in that fading cry he knew. The house was not only a shelter, it was a bridge. Between earth and sky, between past and present, between himself and the voices that still lived in the roots of his family. He slept that night, with the scroll beside him, and for the first time in years, his dreams were not of mistakes or regrets, but of his grandfather's hands guiding his own. Of the thunderbird soaring above the valley, of a boy carving a bear badly but being told it was good enough because it was made with heart. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clear, the kind of clarity that made every edge of pine needles glisten like glass. Samuel Greyfeather woke in the treehouse to the smell of damp wood and the calls of chickadees hopping restlessly along the rail. He had spent several days repairing the roof and reinforcing the porch, and though the work was slow, it filled him with a strange satisfaction. His hands, once used for paychecks in distant towns, now answered to this place that carried his family's breath. That morning he decided to test the floorboards near the corner, where the light never seemed to reach. He had noticed something peculiar during the previous night, a draft rising between the cracks, though no hole was visible beneath. He set down his hammer, crouched low, and pressed his ear to the floor. The sound was hollow, as if the boards spoke with an echo. He pried carefully with a flat iron taken from the wall, easing the plank upward. Beneath was a narrow compartment carved into the tree itself, its interior lined with oilskin to protect against rot. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in faded cloth, bound with leather ties. Samuel's breath hitched as he pulled it free, the weight telling him before his eyes confirmed it. Tools, old but still sharp in spirit. He unwrapped the bundle and discovered a set of carving implements unlike any he had seen. The handles were carved from antler and bone, polished by long use, their surfaces etched with small patterns of leaves, waves, and thunderbirds. The blades, though dulled by time, gleamed faintly in the morning light. Alongside them were sheets of heavy paper, browned with age but intact. He unfolded one carefully, revealing detailed drawings of patterns, spirals, wings, animal figures, all arranged in sequences that looked like stories rather than decorations. Each design carried meaning, the kind of language his grandfather had tried to teach him once, but that Samuel had been too impatient to hear. His hands trembled as he laid the drawings on the cot. They were more than art. They were maps of memory, each line a bridge to those who had carved before him. He saw fish leaping, mountains rising, birds soaring, and figures dancing in circles as if retelling the cycles of life. A knock at the ladder startled him. He leaned out and saw a young man climbing up, his movements eager but awkward, one hand gripping too tightly, the other balancing a satchel. The stranger was in his early 20s, tall and lanky with shoulders still growing into their strength. His hair was dark blonde, cut unevenly, as though by his own hand, and his skin was pale with a scattering of sunburn across his nose. His eyes were a light blue, restless yet curious. He wore a patched jacket, denim worn at the knees, and his boots carried mud from the valley below. When he reached the landing, he introduced himself with a sheepish grin. "Name's Jack Miller. Folks call me Jake. I work down at the feed store, with Tom Barlow. He said you might need an extra pair of hands." I figured I'd come by Jake was not just awkward. He radiated the nervous energy of someone eager to prove himself. He admitted that he had grown up without a father around, raised by his mother and 2 older sisters, and often found himself wandering the woods for comfort. He had always admired Edwin Greyfeather's treehouse from afar, but had never dared climb it. "People said it was haunted," he laughed, scratching at the scruff on his chin that barely qualified as a beard. "But I don't mind ghosts if they've got stories to tell." Samuel studied him a moment. The boy's sincerity was obvious, though beneath it was a hunger for belonging. He remembered how Tom had once spoken kindly of him, saying Jake had the makings of a craftsman if only someone would show him patience. "You can help," Samuel said, motioning him inside. "But understand, this isn't just wood. It's more than that." Jake's eyes widened at the sight of the tools and drawings spread across the cot. He whistled low. "These look ancient. Where'd you find them?" "In the tree itself," Samuel answered. "They were hidden. My grandfather wanted them safe until someone was ready." Jake approached reverently, as though stepping into a church. He touched one of the handles, running his thumb along the carved antler. "Feels alive," he murmured. Samuel nodded. "That's because they were made to carry more than hands." "They carry meaning. These patterns, they're stories. Every line speaks if you know how to listen." The two spent the afternoon examining the tools and drawings, Samuel explaining what he could recall of his grandfather's lessons, Jake asking questions with the hunger of a pupil who had found the teacher he needed. When Samuel demonstrated a simple cut on a block of cedar, Jake watched closely, then tried himself, his movements clumsy but careful. The wood splintered, but Samuel clapped him on the shoulder. "Not bad. You'll learn. The grain teaches better than I do." As dusk approached, Mara Whitfield appeared again, climbing the ladder with a basket balanced on her hip. She had brought goat cheese wrapped in cloth and a jar of preserved cherries. Her presence filled the small space with warmth. She took in the sight of the tools, her eyes widening. "So he left them for you," she said softly. "I always wondered if Edwin had hidden more of his work." He never talked much, but his hands, they spoke every time he carved. She set down the basket and sat, her braid slipping forward over her shoulder. "These drawings," she said, leafing carefully through the sheets. "They look like the same patterns painted on the cave near Cedar Creek. People say the ancestors told their history through designs like these. If you learn them, Samuel, you'll be holding more than a craft. You'll be holding memory." The three of them ate together. The simple meal flavored with quiet conversation. The raven perched above the doorway croaked approval, feathers glinting in twilight. Samuel felt, for the first time in many years, the stirrings of a circle forming. An old man's tools, a young man's hunger to learn, a neighbor's wisdom, and himself in the middle, reluctant yet chosen. That night, when the others had gone, he sat alone with the tools laid before him. The wind moved through the branches like a choir, and the treehouse seemed to lean closer. Samuel whispered aloud, as though speaking to his grandfather, "I will not let this be forgotten. I will learn, I will keep it." And the forest answered with silence, so deep it felt like a scent. The snowmelt had begun to carve rivulets through the valley, feeding the creek below the treehouse until its voice was louder than ever. Samuel Greyfeather worked alongside Jake Miller, teaching him to sharpen blades properly, guiding his hand over cedar planks as they practiced the old cuts from Edwin's drawings. Mara Whitfield stopped by often, bringing food or simply resting in the doorway while the men worked, her calm presence like the steady beat of a drum. The rhythm of these days gave Samuel a sense of belonging he had not felt in years, until the outside world came knocking. It began with the low growl of an engine grinding up the ridge road one morning, the sound foreign against the choir of birds. Samuel stepped onto the porch and squinted into the sunlight. A black SUV, polished to a corporate sheen, crawled up the dirt track, spitting gravel as it stopped beneath the tree. From it emerged a man whose presence seemed as carefully manufactured as the vehicle itself. The leader was Martin Caldwell, a regional executive for North Timber Incorporated. Caldwell was in his early 60s, but he wore his years like armor. He was tall, lean, his posture rigid from a lifetime of boardrooms rather than fields. His face was all sharp edges, cheekbones cut high, nose straight, chin square. A neatly trimmed gray beard framed his mouth, lending him the air of authority he cultivated deliberately. His eyes, pale blue and cool, had the assessing gaze of a banker counting assets. He wore a dark wool coat over a tailored suit, incongruous in the wilderness, the gleam of an expensive watch flashing as he adjusted his cuff. Two men flanked him as he climbed the ladder with surprising confidence for someone unused to wood beneath his shoes. They were younger, mid-30s, broad-shouldered, dressed in work jackets but with the stiff bearing of hired muscle. One had a scar across his cheek, hair buzzed close, eyes darting restlessly. The other carried himself with slow deliberation, his beard thick and dark, his stare heavy but detached. They introduced themselves only as Cole and Riker, names that landed like stones. Caldwell surveyed the interior of the treehouse, his lips twitching in faint amusement. "So this is it," he said, running a gloved hand across the carved beam. "The infamous nest your grandfather wasted his last years on." "I can't imagine why anyone would cling to this," Samuel's jaw tightened. "It's not for you to imagine." Caldwell ignored the jab, gesturing out the window toward the ridges beyond. "What I see is opportunity. Timber ripe for harvest, land that could be cleared for real use. North Timber is prepared to offer you a handsome sum for this property. More money than this, structure will ever yield." Jake, standing by the cot, bristled. "It's not just timber," he said, voice sharp. "This place holds history." Caldwell gave him a thin smile, dismissive. "History doesn't pay bills, son." His gaze returned to Samuel. "You're a practical man. Surely you see the futility of clinging to decaying wood and superstition. Sell to us, and you walk away comfortable. Refuse, and you'll find the county is less accommodating when it comes to land taxes, permits, and inspections. These hills have a way of bending toward progress. Whether you like it or not, Mara, who had arrived quietly during the exchange, stepped forward, her braid swinging over her shoulder. "Progress?" she repeated, her voice cold. "You mean stripping the mountain bare, leaving scars for generations?" "My family's orchard burned once because men like you didn't care where sparks landed. We rebuilt. But I won't watch you turn this land to ash for profit." Caldwell's expression hardened, the amusement gone. He turned back to Samuel, voice lowered but heavy with threat. "Think carefully. Nostalgia won't keep the roof from caving in. This is your last chance to choose wisely." Samuel met his gaze steadily. The memory of his grandfather's words pressed against his chest like a heartbeat. "Listen to the forest. Protect it." He stepped closer, his voice quiet but unyielding. "This land isn't for sale." "Not now? Not ever. You see trees to cut? I see roots that hold more than timber. You're standing in my grandfather's house, and I'll not dishonor him by trading it for your coin." For a long moment, silence stretched tight in the room. The only sound was the creak of branches above, and the rush of the creek below. Caldwell studied him, the corner of his mouth twitching into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Stubbornness runs in families, I see." "Very well. We'll be in touch." With a snap of his fingers, he turned and descended the ladder, his men following like shadows. The SUV's engine roared, echoing through the trees until it faded into distance. When they were gone, the treehouse seemed to exhale. Jake let out a breath he had been holding, fists still clenched. "They'll be back," he said. Mara placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. You stood your ground. But they don't give up easily. You need allies, Samuel. More than me, more than Jake. If they push through county channels, they'll bury you in papers and politics before they swing an axe. Samuel looked at the carvings laid out on the cot, the tools gleaming faintly in twilight. He thought of Edwin's words, of Henry Tallfeather's warning, of the voices of the forest he had begun to hear. The decision settled in him like stone. They can mock all they want, he said. They call it a nest, a ruin. But this place is more alive than they'll ever understand. Let them come. I'll protect it, even if it costs me everything. The raven croaked from the porch, wings beating against the setting sun, as if to seal the vow. The confrontation with Martin Caldwell lingered in Samuel Greyfeather's mind long after the SUV's growl had faded down the ridge. Yet the echo of Edwin's words, "Protect it, for it holds us," gave him a calm resolve. The forest itself seemed to rally, its wind steady, its branches holding him upright. But he knew that to resist a corporation's pressure, he could not stand alone. He needed hands, hearts, and the strength of community. 2 days later, he drove into White Elk to gather supplies, and perhaps courage. The town looked the same. Weathered storefronts, the neon diner light flickering, the old grain silo leaning like a drunk giant. But his view of it had shifted. This wasn't just a place of gossip and sideways glances. It held allies he hadn't yet called upon. At the hardware store, while checking rope lengths, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Uncle Sam?" The words carried both surprise and joy. He turned, and there she was. Lila Greyfeather, his brother's daughter. Lila was 24, tall and willowy, with straight black hair that fell to her mid-back, often braided with small beads at the ends. Her skin was a warm copper, her features sharp in the way of the Greyfeathers, high cheekbones, steady jaw, and eyes deep brown, alive with fire. She wore a faded denim jacket patched at the elbows, jeans tucked into worn boots, and a satchel covered in hand-painted designs slung across her chest. Lila studied art at a small college downstate, but she had returned to White Elk for the summer after her grandmother's illness. Independent, outspoken, and bold in spirit, she carried the kind of restless energy Samuel remembered in himself when he was her age. "Didn't expect to see you back," she said, her smile half teasing, half relieved. "The family whispered you'd disappeared for good." "Turns out I had to come home to find something worth staying for," Samuel replied. Over coffee at June Perkins's Mercantile, Lila listened as Samuel explained the treehouse, the tools, and the company's looming threat. Her eyes lit at the mention of Edwin's carvings. "I always thought Grandpa's stories were metaphors," she said softly. "But you found the actual language." "Uncle, this is bigger than us. We can't just protect it, we can share it." Lila introduced Samuel to her friend from town, Caleb Harris, who arrived at the cafe with sketchbooks under one arm. Caleb was 19, freckled and lanky, with curly red hair that refused to obey any comb, pale skin, and a habit of chewing his pencil ends. He wore thick glasses that slid down his nose and spoke with a mix of shyness and bursts of enthusiasm. Caleb had grown up fascinated by native stories and local folklore, spending hours in the library copying symbols and recording oral histories. Often dismissed by his peers as odd, he had found kinship in books rather than people. When Lila beckoned him over, his eyes widened at Samuel's presence. "This is him?" Caleb asked, voice cracking slightly. "The grandson of Edwin Greyfeather?" "The one with the treehouse?" Samuel nodded, and Caleb's hands shook as he flipped open a sketchbook. Inside were drawings of carvings and patterns he had found on caves and old wood panels around Cedar Creek. Some mirrored the very designs Samuel had uncovered. "See?" Caleb said breathlessly. "I've been trying to decode them for years." If you have the tools, the stories, this could be a real revival. The three of them agreed to meet at the Treehouse the next morning. By noon, the wooden platform was alive with voices. Jake arrived early, sleeves rolled up, eager to prove himself. Mara came too, carrying jars of goat milk and watching the young ones with the patience of someone who had seen communities form and collapse before. Together they spread Edwin's drawings across the floor. Samuel taught them what little he remembered and what the forest had reminded him of. He showed them how to respect the grain, how to let the knife follow rather than force. Jake practiced small cuts until his fingers blistered but kept smiling. Lila painted the designs onto paper, envisioning how to teach them to children in simple steps. Caleb cataloged each symbol, connecting them with stories he had read. Mara, though not of the family line, lent the wisdom of someone rooted deeply in the land. As the sun lowered, the porch was filled with carved shapes: birds, fish, spirals, and thunderbirds, small but alive. Samuel looked around at the circle that had formed, young and old, family and neighbor, each giving their time. For the first time, the treehouse was not just a relic or burden. It was a workshop, a classroom, a sanctuary. That evening, after the others left, Samuel stood on the porch watching the valley swallow the sun. The raven perched close, its feathers glowing in the last light. He whispered to the air, "We've begun, Grandpa." "They won't silence us." "Not now." The raven croaked in answer, and the night accepted the vow. A full year passed since Samuel Greyfeather first unlocked the rusted hinge of his grandfather's treehouse, and the mountain bore witness to the change. Spring had rolled into summer, summer into a hard autumn, and now another spring was unfurling across the ridge. The once decaying structure had been transformed. Shingles gleamed freshly laid, beams had been reinforced, and the interior was alive with tools, wood shavings, and the laughter of young voices. The house no longer creaked like an old man in pain, but breathed like something reborn. By now, word had spread beyond White Elk. Travelers drove up the gravel roads, following signs painted by Lila to see the Sky Workshop. They came to watch demonstrations, to hear stories passed down through carvings, and to walk the forest paths guided by those who had grown close to Samuel and his circle. What had once been mocked as a rotting nest had become a living school of tradition, attracting both locals and outsiders eager for meaning. On a bright morning, Samuel stood on the porch, watching as Jake, now stronger, guided a group of children through their first clumsy carvings. His hands, once blistered, now moved with growing confidence. Beside him, Caleb carefully translated symbols into stories, his sketchbooks thick with records. Lila, vibrant in a new dress she had dyed with bark pigment, led visitors through the history of the Greyfeather line, her voice carrying both authority and warmth. Mara, steadfast as always, served food to weary travelers and reminded them that heritage was nourished in body as much as in spirit. But the heart of it all remained Samuel, who had chosen not to be just a caretaker, but a bridge. His hair had grown longer and grayer, his scarred jaw softened by lines of laughter. The stern weight he had carried into White Elk a year earlier had lifted, replaced with a quiet pride. On that day, a new visitor arrived, climbing the ladder with the deliberate steps of someone who carried both dignity and fatigue. She was a woman in her late 40s, tall and angular, her figure upright despite the heaviness in her shoulders. Her hair was black, streaked with silver, cut to frame her sharp cheekbones. Her skin was pale, freckled across the nose, and her eyes were a piercing hazel that seemed always to seek truth. She wore a plain navy dress under a weathered trench coat, a leather satchel slung across her body. Her name was Eleanor Price. Eleanor was a journalist from Helena, working for a regional magazine that specialized in cultural preservation. Years spent chasing stories had etched determination into her features. Once married but long divorced, she had learned to rely on her instincts more than anyone else's promises. She had come to White Elk after hearing of a treehouse that had become a cultural beacon, curious to see if rumor matched reality. Inside, she sat across from Samuel, notebook open, pen poised. "You realize," she said, her voice even but firm, "that what you've built here is more than a family workshop. It's a movement. People are hungry for roots, for stories, for meaning. You've tapped into something far bigger than this ridge." Samuel nodded slowly, sipping coffee from a carved wooden mug. "I didn't build it alone. This house, it listens. The mountain speaks, the young hands carve, and the old stories breathe again. I just held the door open." Eleanor smiled faintly, jotting down his words. "And what about the company? North Timber? Their interest hasn't vanished. You've stood firm for a year, but do you expect them to stop?" Samuel's gaze moved to the window, where an eagle cut across the sky with effortless grace. "They'll come again, I'm sure. But they'll find more than one man standing here now. They'll find a community." That afternoon, as visitors dispersed and the workshop quieted, Samuel gathered everyone on the porch. The young, the old, the curious, all had become part of the treehouse's rhythm. He looked at each of them, Jake with sawdust in his hair, Lila with paint-stained hands, Caleb with ink smudges on his fingers, Mara with her steady eyes, and he felt the truth of what had grown. "This house," he said, his voice carrying across the valley, "is not mine alone. It is ours. It was mocked, dismissed, nearly forgotten. But now it stands as proof that heritage breathes when we breathe it, that memory is alive when we choose to remember. We have made it a place of hope. And when the eagles fly above, when the ravens call, they know we are listening." The group fell silent, the words settling like roots into soil. Overhead, 3 eagles wheeled together in the fading light, their wings catching the sun as though answering his declaration. Samuel smiled, not the weary smile of a man burdened by duty, but the bright one of someone who had given and been given back. The house that was once mocked now stood as a beacon. He knew Edwin would have been proud. And he knew that the spirit of the gray feathers, carved into every beam, whispered through every story, would live on long after his own hands had grown still. Sometimes, what the world mocks as worthless is exactly where God plants the seed of a miracle. Samuel's treehouse was not just wood and nails. It became a sanctuary of memory, a bridge between generations, and a living reminder that the Creator speaks through wind, through trees, and through the work of our hands. In our daily lives, we too may feel overlooked, dismissed, or told that our struggles are meaningless. But just as Samuel discovered, God's blessings often wait inside what seems broken, hidden until we dare to look deeper. If this story touched your heart, share it with others so they too may find hope in forgotten places. Leave a comment below. What is the treehouse in your own life, the place or memory that reminds you of God's presence? Don't forget to subscribe, because every story here carries a light of faith, resilience, and love. May the Lord bless you, protect your families, and remind you that even in the ruins of yesterday, He is building tomorrow's miracles.